Yeah, so I was lucky enough that my parents, taught me some music, and I had, private lessons of piano.
Hmm.
So I love music, and then I started medicine school, and also I continued with piano. So I had two majors, but of course it took me a little longer to finish medicine. But
Yeah.
then I was done with medicine, and then I started to work as a clinician, right?
Hmm.
Uh, but I always had this sense of I want to know what happens in the brain and the music and some clinical applications. So I applied for a master's, and I was lucky to get in, and my supervisor was very nice. And then I started to work on music for chronic pain and doing this magnetic resonance imaging so
Hmm.
that we can measure the function of the brain. And then I landed here, which is the Center for Music in the Brain, which is the biggest center of this kind of neuroscience of music. And yes, and so I have actually my dream job. I always wanted to do this. So uh, yes, that's how I came here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so good to hear because I know are you a postdoctoral researcher at the moment? Is that your position?
Now I'm a postdoc. Yeah, yeah. So it's a new
Yeah.
position. It's based on projects, but
Hmm.
yeah, I was lucky enough to continue the work I did in my PhD and still develop it.
Yeah.
And if I may, I explain you a little bit
Of
what I
course.
do, which is so we are interested in how the brain, um, how we perceive groove in
Mm.
music, which is this pleasurable desire to move to the beat, right? And
Yeah.
how is it that the brain does it? It's very interesting how our brain collects information from the environment and integrates that information with previous knowledge or associations, predictions. Okay,
Mm.
so in order to study this integration of what we call bottom up and top down,
Hmm.
how the brain is integrating this information, music is very helpful because it is a complex stimulus, and then so for example we can study uh, how is it that from the moment we start to listen to a nice beat that we like, then we start automatically moving our body, tapping to the rhythm, dancing, whatever, right?
Hmm.
So this is what we call groove, a pleasurable desire to move. Okay, and so we have found through studies and MRI that there's an inverted U-shape
Mm.
relationship. Okay, so as we increase the complexity of rhythms, okay, our ability to predict what happens next diminishes. Okay, because for example, an isochronous rhythm, boom, 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 has zero complexity because we can predict exactly the next one. Okay, so it's boring.
Yeah.
On the other side, if we have a very complex rhythm, our brain cannot create a model of what we are perceiving a long time. So it will sound something like dun 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 dun, and then we cannot dance to that.
Mm.
But there's a middle part, a sweet spot that allows for some violations of the expectation. Okay, and then our brain kind of wants to fill in, and that's when we start to move, and it's something like ten 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 ten. Okay, so there's a violation of our expectations of the prediction. Our brain wants to fill it in, and then we start to move, and then we feel pleasure. Okay,
Yeah.
so these mechanisms through MRI, we've seen that there are special areas in the brain that are more active when the rhythm is groovy than when it's not groovy.
Mm.
Okay, and such areas include the basal ganglia. Okay,
Mm.
these areas of the basal ganglia are dysfunctional in Parkinson's disease patients. Okay, so this is a very privileged position because we can build a bridge between basic research, which is what are the mechanisms, how is music and groove expressed in the brain, and build into clinical applications. So the effects, how is groovy music affect Parkinson's disease patients. So one hypothesis can be that the experience of groove depends on the normal function of these basal ganglia, because we compare healthy adults with Parkinson's patients, and they behave differently. So we can speculate and say, okay, the basal ganglia are very important for that, right? On the other side of the bridge is the clinical applications. We know that there's this method called rhythmic auditory stimulation, which is based on a metronome. If you cue the patients with a metronome and you increase a little bit the tempo, then features in their gait will improve, like the stride length, the cadence, the speed, they improve, okay? But this effect is very small. We don't know exactly. So some patients respond and some do not. It seems to be related to the progression of the disease and how well they have these timing abilities. But now what I want to do is what happens when we increase a little bit the complexity of the rhythm. Instead of just a metronome, we increase the complexity, so then we try to evoke some other responses in the brain, like pleasure. And of course, the pleasure and the reward network also runs through the basal ganglia. It's just another part of the basal ganglia. One is ventral and one is dorsal. So it is a motor and the reward system. So that's mainly what I'm trying to study, this interaction.
That's amazing, because one of the questions I got so many questions to ask you. I'm getting over all the questions I want to ask you, but I know I know that obviously, from what I understand, that music involves the whole brain. And when it comes to listening to music, as opposed to me playing an instrument, which we'll get to separately in a minute, when say listening to music, are certain parts of the brain being used more than others? Say you mentioned basal ganglia there. When you listen to music, are parts like amygdala or cerebellum getting used more than, say, the prefrontal cortex or cerebrum, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So actually, I just published a paper in Nature, in Scientific Reports last year, in which a meta-analysis is an analysis of published studies that they are already there, right? So I took studies of MRI and music. So participants inside the MRI scanner listening to music or playing music with a special keyboard, or imagining music, okay? So you can measure those things in the brain. And there's a special statistical analysis which you take, so try to think of the brain as a map, and you have coordinates, right? So you say, okay, the amygdala is active in this paradigm. And then you say the coordinates, X, Y, Z, okay? And then you publish that in your brain. What I do with the meta-analysis is I take those coordinates and I put it in the software, and it does this called activation likelihood estimation. And it kind of groups all the published studies together to see which areas are consistent. Okay, so this study included 130 studies of music, cognition overall, which includes perception, production, and imagery. And we found differences and areas that are equally activated in the three of them. For example, the premotor cortex, okay, which is right in the middle, is active in all three. Okay, when we compare perception, just listening, to production, there are still areas, motor and auditory areas in both, but of course there are more areas, more extended areas when we are producing a movement, of course, right? The cerebellum is also more active. There are different areas that are more active while producing. And in the imagery, there's a specific area for that in the parietal lobe, that it's very active when we are doing nothing, when we are like tripping, thinking about whatever random things, okay? So, of course, my results confirm everything that's published over the last 30 years, and then we can see which areas are different. And then the framing of the paper runs around the predictive coding theory, how we integrate bottom-up information with top-down.
Yeah.
So you can say that perception is both bottom-up, top-down, and production is also bottom-up. You're doing, but you're listening to yourself, while imagery is more a top-down. You are not actually listening to anything, but it's almost like you can hear. So there's also activity in secondary auditory areas while you are imagining music. So you are activate the auditory areas even though you are not hearing anything. Okay?